take that target of just say 12 empty days is our target, we have 6 excess non-productive days incurred per litter. And now that doesn't maybe sound enormous, but for your average 700 sow herd, the excess days there is corresponding to a direct cost of €181 per week, and that equates to almost €10,000 per year. And this direct cost, that's just looking at feeding, housing, healthcare, husbandry, and any and all other costs associated with keeping non-productive sows in our herd. But if you look at the opportunity cost of that, because we have less productive days, those 6 excess empty days have cost us 8 pig sales a week. It tots up to 430 pig sales per year that we're missing out on in a given 12 months.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Pig Edge, Teagasc's pig podcast with me, Amy Quinn, where we are bringing you the latest news, information and advice to keep Irish pig farmers up to date. On this episode, we focus on breeding and reproduction, and to do this we are joined by Specialised Pig Advisor Emer McCrum to share her thoughts and experiences. Emer, you're out there on the ground on farms every week. Are there common issues or maybe even a theme of issues that keep popping up time and time again?
Yes, Amy, I would say from reviewing the quarterly reports to date this year and from discussions with farmers just in general too, one particular issue we are seeing, and it has impacted a wider number of farms, is just overall breeding performance. So I'd be seeing a good deal of the production related queries as well, all in the area of breeding in one way or another. So it seems to be a shared experience across the number of farms. And look, as we know, breeding results, they can be notorious for seasonal fluctuations, and it's not uncommon for farms to maybe go through a difficult quarter only to bounce back in the next. But we have seen for the last 2 quarters just performance across a number of those key breeding indicators. It's back on where it was. And it is very difficult to say maybe what the main cause is, as like a lot of aspects of pig production, it can be multifactorial. And generally breeding problems are farm specific, but I would encourage producers just to do a general health check in this area. So just see how you're performing overall and maybe try to identify where the pinch points are if they exist. And, usually when we're going through a checklist, we can identify by a process of elimination something maybe that's not being done on farm or has perhaps slipped off the priority list. But before we get to that, maybe I'd say just start off by sitting down, studying your recent reports and get a better picture of what those figures are telling you.
Okay, so how would you suggest producers go about looking at their unit's breeding performance to start? It's looking at those reports really, isn't it?
Yes, that's it. And I suppose we could take a deep dive into the various reproductive KPIs and go through each factor behind it and maybe the targets for each. But instead, I might just advise producers just to focus on the number of empty days per litter, as this is a very good indicator of overall reproductive performance. So we know those empty days, they can also be called non-productive days or lost days, and it's defined as any day where a sow or gilt of breeding age present in the herd is not either gestating or lactating. And really that empty day calculation, it's taken the cycle from start to finish into consideration rather than certain aspects in isolation. So therefore, it is a reliable indicator of how a given herd is performing in reproductive terms. So in other words, this figure, it's influenced by the conception farm rates, the litters per sow, the average weaning age and sow mortality. It's all feeding into this figure. So it's a good snapshot in itself. And we've a target there of in the region of 11 to 12 empty days per litter. Look, some should argue this ideally should be below 10, but as an annual average, if you're at or below that 11 or 12, it's a good result overall. And I say this because, look, some farms might notice that figure can vary during the year and possibly increase slightly more in that late summer into autumn period. But why I'd focus on this, and I suppose it's quite a nice comparison, it's in financial terms, there is a direct cost associated with empty days. That's currently calculated at €2.96 per day. And this is very simply based on the cost of keeping extra sows in the herd. But if we look beyond that, for each empty day you're incurring, you're reducing the number of possible productive days. So that therefore in turn limits your litters per sow per year. And that's where the true economic impact of empty days is coming. It's from the fewer litters, and really factoring in the opportunity cost of empty days, that puts that financial figure a lot higher.
So if we stick with empty days, Emer, how are Irish farms in general performing in terms of this metric?
Yeah, so nationally, the average number of empty days per litter on our Teagasc national report in 2023 was 15 days. But just if we look more recently, and that's why I mentioned it from the outset, I took just a cohort of 33 farms that had data uploaded onto the Profit Monitor from the 1st of January to the 30th of June this year. And we found that the average was sitting at empty days per litter. So there is room for improvement here. And that is showing us that breeding performance is being hit. And if we take that target of, just say for ease, 12 empty days is our target, we have 6 excess non-productive days incurred per litter. And now that doesn't maybe sound enormous, but for your average 700 sow herd, the excess days there is corresponding to a direct cost of €181 per week. And that equates to almost €10,000 per year. And this direct cost, that's just looking at the feeding, housing, healthcare, husbandry, and any and all other costs associated with keeping non-productive sows in our herd. But if you look at the opportunity cost of that, because we have less productive days, those 6 excess empty days have cost us 8 pig sales a week. And again, doesn't maybe sound dramatic, but it tots up to 430 pig sales per year that we're missing out on in a given 12 months. So all those figures are adding up, and this is telling us that any improvements in breeding results will have a significant impact on the bottom line and can also improve the utilisation of facilities on farm too.
So the empty days figure is essentially a snapshot figure, but I suppose there is more to the picture than that.
Yes, exactly, Amy. It's sometimes overlooked, the empty days figure, as we generally tend to speak in terms of conception and farrowing rates, but it is a critical KPI and it's an excellent indicator of breeding performance as a whole. And I suppose one area we would encounter frequently, and this is shared with the other advisors as well, and that's the whole area of gilt condition at service. Some producers could be listening and they could be thinking to themselves, look, I'm happy with my gilts. Generally, they're performing well. But I suppose I might ask, could they be performing better? Are we optimizing the performance of our gilts? Or maybe has that animal got a little bit more to give? And the most critical aspect we're seeing is gilt condition at service, as this is key to determining the lifetime performance of the animal. So that old advice of a lighter and younger animal, it just no longer applies. And if your gilt is too young at service, she's going to be too small at farrowing, and this will negatively impact intakes that need to be realised in that first lactation. So in short, we need a gilt presenting for service a minimum of 33, 34 weeks of age, but not more than 38 weeks, as beyond that point, you have higher incidence of lameness just because of their larger body frames. And really, the nub of this issue goes back to nutrition. So we need to be introducing our gilts to our developer or our rarer diet from sort of 60 kilos to 80 kilos live weight. And this is an investment in maximising the lifetime performance of the animal. And it shouldn't be neglected. Our modern genetics now, those females will struggle to perform to full potential and achieve optimal longevity if we're feeding our gilts on a finisher ration to final selection or right through to sale. The rarer is going to give our future herd the best possible start. And it also reduces some of those foot and leg complaints, which can cause significant problems later on down the line. And therefore, it'll help to reduce some of the involuntary culling that's occurring on farms too. And just one little point related to, I suppose, the nutrition, and that's the back fat level of gilts. This is something we need to keep an eye on, because gilts require fat for hormone production to stimulate puberty and estrus onset. So fat isn't a bad thing just once it's not excessive. So I'm not advocating for a fat gilt, but having that 14 to 15 millimeters back fat on your gilts at service, because research has shown that when you're at that 14, 15 millimeter back fat, the gilt can produce 1 to 1.5 extra live born when compared to maybe 12 millimeters of back fat at service. And in addition, piglets born from optimum back fat gilts have a higher growth weight and weaning weight than those born to low back fat gilts. So nutrition and age are key to achieving this. Making sure you're doing your body condition scoring at regular intervals. Your back fat scanning is more accurate, but it's not routinely carried out on units. Make sure you're doing your body condition scoring. Definitely when you're stimulating that first heat or a week before commencing synchronization, you want to make sure you're getting your target back fats. Certainly any less than 14 millimeters, look at increasing the feed allowance for those animals. So just make sure as well that you've got a tight handle on the age of gilts. So just ensure your dam line gilts are tagged with the birth week number, either at birth or weaning, and keep these animals together for the remainder of the rarer stage. And just be quite disciplined on the number of gilts needed per week. So stick to the group of gilts destined for that week. Don't be tempted maybe to pull from next week's or the week after, because that's affecting your age. And if we're consistent on these parameters, then we will hit our target age.
Emer, you mentioned the importance of back fat. How would farms go about measuring this?
Yes, so it's not commonly practiced on units around the country, certainly, Amy, but you can quite simply get a back fat scanner. They do cost the region of 800 to €900, but they are very effective in terms of the body condition scoring. There is a little margin for error, and sometimes it can be depending on the person. Whereas the back fat scanner, it is more specific, far better than visual scoring in that sense. And you can just use your back fat scanner just before the gilts are synchronized, or maybe when you're getting the estrus stimulated in your gilts, and then again at service. And just to say as well that some of the pregnancy scanners now, or pregnancy testers, they have the option of back fat scanning as well. So maybe just look at the make and model you have, or maybe if you're in the market for a new pregnancy scanner, consider investing in one that can do both. Because even if you tried it for a short period of time, just until you get used to visually what your gilt looks like with the optimum back fat levels, it's not something you'd have to continue weekly going forward. Just to get a feel for it and a better idea of what that animal physically looks like, a back fat scanning is a good idea.
Absolutely, because it does take the subjectivity out of it, really, doesn't it?
That's it, exactly. And that's, I think, where the problem lies maybe in, and again, it's the same when you're looking at the same group of animals every week, every day, day in, day out. Sometimes it can be hard to objectively look and really, I suppose, get a feel for, are we at the right target weights and conditions here?
Emer, you mentioned synchronization briefly, which is now quite a common practice out there on farms. From your experience and maybe discussions with farmers, is this working well in practice?
Yes, absolutely, Amy. Many farms now are synchronizing their gilts, and look, it's an excellent tool. It's working quite well. But I will just say it is sometimes, again, when we're on farm going back through practices, there can be little slippages off maybe where we should be at. So just a reminder of the cardinal rules regarding synchronization. Firstly, it's absolutely essential that all your gilts have had their first heat before commencing treatment, and full physical contact with the boar will seriously help this. Fence line contact just isn't quite sufficient to get that initial estrus stimulation. So if you have a sectomized boar, even better, letting the boar into the pen for 15, 20 minutes per day will get that cycling and will get you that strong first heat. And then we're looking, I suppose, at some of the other rules. We need to make sure we have our gilts trained up. So using the apple juice for a couple of days before we start treatment, that's really important. And just to say as well, the window with treatment times is actually very, very tight. And ideally, dosing times can only vary by a maximum of 10 minutes either side of the allocated time. And if we're not strict on timing, our gilts might still conceive, but it will cost us in born alive if we're not keeping the time to a maximum allowance of 10 minutes either side. So for this reason, when you are planning your synchronization, just make sure the time of day that you're selecting suits not only your weekly routine, but your weekend duty too. Because at the end of the day, there's time and there's effort involved in synchronizing gilts. So to maximize performance here, just be very vigilant of treatment time. And just to say as well, I suppose gilt synchronization in isolation probably isn't a silver bullet. So just going back to, we need to make sure we're delivering on nutrition, quality housing, and our boar contact, as all of these factors are feeding into overall success and help to maximize conception rates.
Now, Emer, if we look at mating and insemination specifically, what are some of the main challenges coming up during visits that are causing problems out there?
Yes, and I suppose a good place to start, Amy, could be just looking at the data. And if we go back to that subset of farms, your average conception rate for the first 6 months of this year is coming in at 93.5%. But just to say, there was a range of about 10% within those figures from 88 up to 98. So there's certainly room for improvement on certain farms. And some of the main issues we'd see, firstly, in relation to the number of hangbacks or lyrebacks. And some farms have chronic problems with lyrebacks occurring almost every week. And firstly, it's very important to identify the underlying cause. And secondly, to ensure you have good management protocol in place where you have got hangbacks in excessive numbers, especially. And maybe where there isn't an obvious health or physical issue with the animals, such as maybe excessive condition loss or injury, the most likely cause is the sow has had a silent heat in the farrowing house. So any disruption to her suckling stimulus, particularly in the final week prior to weaning, can trigger that heat onset. So just make sure you're not removing or remixing piglets at this stage. And probably your biggest risk factor as well is snatch weaning. And we do need to be aware of that because we are seeing hangbacks or lyrebacks on farms. And I suppose another issue we're seeing as well is the increased use of nurse sows. And because we have the nurse sows going on for a longer lactation, some sows could be at risk of excessive lactation length. Now, usually in two-step nurse sow scenarios, that problem is avoided. But if you have a higher weaning age and maybe you are stepping sows back later on in lactation, just keep an eye on her condition and the eventual weaning age as well. You need to make sure you're keeping a close eye on her intake and milking ability to ensure she's not going to have any adverse effects. And there is the rule of thumb there in terms of you have to make sure lactation length does not exceed 70 days, but that's still, it's a big ask for a sow. So just keeping close eye on her in the farrowing house and trying to avoid excessive lactation lengths, as sometimes when you have the lyre back, it could be your nurse sow. And just make sure in terms of management then, feed those sows to full appetite, and maybe after 30 days post-weaning, if you're not seeing any return to heat or any sign of heat, then that animal should be earmarked for culling. And the other thing then, and I sound like a bit of a broken record here because we do mention light anytime we're discussing breeding, but I really can't stress how important this point is, especially at this time of the year when we are heading towards, we don't want to think about it now, but it is coming, that shortening day length and that higher risk of autumn infertility raising its head again. So just making sure your timers for 16 hours coming on at about 5:30, 6 a.m. and at least 300 lux is what we're looking for. And the same rules apply really in all stage of gilt and sow accommodation, but just looking specifically at our service area, the installation of extra lights or LED strips sort of 2 to 4 foot above the sow's head can really help with the spread of light. Same with cleaning light covers and whitewashing wall. That all helps with light intensity and getting that light to sow level as well. So you can always ask your local advisor there just to check the lux readings, or if it's something you want to monitor yourself on a more ongoing basis, you can purchase a lux meter from hardware shops. They cost roughly in the region of €100 in or around. And I suppose maybe in terms of post-weaning sows, just making sure you're getting a high quality lactation diet there into them at full feeding. Some use dry sow, but just be careful if you're topping up that you're not using any weaner or other grower diets here. Just stick to your sow diets, making sure plenty of water available. And I would say as well, just keep an eye on the dung behind the sows in the service area. So you want to see formed but soft dung here. And if you are seeing hard golf balls, then just speak to your nutritionist on that. And just lastly then, Amy, stimulation of the sour gilt during insemination is very important. So this sounds very basic and very simple, but the use of pig buddies and sandbags can help. But I will just point out your physical manipulation of the animal by hand is recommended too. And research has shown that extra stimulation during insemination can yield an additional 0.5 to 0.8 of a pig born alive. So just making sure plenty of stimulation in the service area at service time.
So that's conception rates, Emer, but there is more to the breeding picture, I suppose, than this, and this can often be a place where people are being caught out.
Absolutely, Amy, yes. And going back to that subset of farms, our conception rate, like we said, is just over 93%. But when we look at the farrowing rate for that period, it's at 86% for the first 6 months of the year. So within that cohort, there is a spread from 81% up to 94.5%. But the data really there overall is telling us that the point of concern is post-breeding management, because we're off target where the farrowing rate is concerned. So to start off with, it's mixing time. And again, producers are very aware of this, but sometimes there can be facility constraints in units and the timing of mixing might not be taking place on target. But if this isn't done correctly, it's going to cost you in your conception and your farrowing rates. So making sure your sows and gilts are mixed within 48 hours of the second service. Still in all, we still can see this slipping into day 3 and beyond, but that's just making trouble for yourself. So stick as close as you can to that 48-hour mark. And when you are mixing, just give females a full feed. Just try and encourage them to lie down and maybe provide additional enrichment just to act as a distraction, again, in order to minimize aggression. And sometimes what we see there as well is just the environment in the dry sow house not being very comfortable. So making sure our house is warm, but definitely not stuffy or humid. So we need it to be well ventilated without excessive air movements. Making sure that house is warm and dry around that 21, 22 degrees, and just watching out for drafts as well. So if you have a deep tank and that tank is maybe empty, just make sure there's no drafts from under the slats. That will be picked up with your temperature sensors. And so a good idea is just to do a smoke test over those slats, especially on a windy day, to see if there's an upward draft from the tank. And then in terms of managing in that initial period, post-service, we want to catch any returns as soon as possible. And really, a careful observation of sows from sort of 14, 15 days post-service for any signs of slight discharge or any sort of sticky mucus that might highlight sows that are likely to return. And again, this is a very simple task, and I can appreciate people are busy on any given work day, but I can't highlight enough the importance of walking the board through the dry sow house daily to check for any served females on heat, concentrating in particular on served gilt pens and sow pens 3 and 6 weeks post service. So it's one of the best tools we have in our arsenal to detect repeats, and should be given the time in order to try and catch those repeats as early as we can. But speaking of the best tools we have, really to eliminate any guesswork, then we are talking about pregnancy testing, and it's an excellent way to reduce NIPS and aid in the reduction of empty days. So for any of those farms who are on the lower end in terms of empty days and keeping that figure very, very tight, practically all are scanning or pregnancy testing. So don't forget, one NIP detected at 80 days is equivalent to 4 regular repeats. And it's not always possible to catch all of our repeats through observation. So scanning around that day 28, it's a very reliable way to improve your rate of repeats, of detecting your repeats. And some of the newer technology there and the scanners that are available on the market, they're very user-friendly, and there's very, very good backup support and training available for new users. So it's certainly worth building that into your protocol every week.
Emer, you discussed gilts in relation to body condition earlier, but in terms of the sow herd, how does this look out there on farms, and are there any developments in the area of sow feeding?
Yes, definitely sow feeding. It's an area that has been getting extra attention in more recent years, and this is certainly reflected at farm level in terms of the condition of sows we're seeing. And I suppose really, in terms of developments, I've been on a few farms recently who've implemented a new feeding strategy. So essentially your diet and your curve hasn't changed, but they've moved towards 2 feeds back to back within 20, 30 minutes of each other first thing in the morning. And this has actually made a significant impact on condition and subsequent farrowing house performance, because one of the problems that can crop up in farms is increasing variation in body condition within groups or pens. And you have the usual case where the larger sow gets bigger and that thinner sow maybe remains slightly on edge with some condition rebuilt. But if we're feeding our sows back to back, that larger, oftentimes the bully sow, she'll get her fill in the first feed. And when the second feed is fed out then in such quick succession, so within that 20 to 30 minutes, she's already full, she's not as interested, and that leaves plenty of space at the trough, which means that the gilts and certainly some of the thinner animals, if there are any in the group, they all get sufficient time to feed. And this can also help with aggression too, if you are seeing maybe little bits of that on farm. And the result of that is just more even sows towards the end of pregnancy. But just to forewarn, the farms in question who implemented it, they did have sort of a 2-week transition while sows acclimatized to this change, but it's working well for those producers, and they certainly wouldn't revert back to previous protocol. So it could be an option for those experiencing similar issues. And just the other point on this then is in relation to water to meal ratios. Look, it's not always something we can change on farm because of the physical infrastructure and layout on site. Generally, we're seeing 4.5 up to 5 to 1 on farms for dry sow feeding, and this is sufficient. But once you sort of start going up beyond 5 and heading up towards 5.5 to 1, sows are going to just struggle with the sheer volume required of intakes, and they physically won't be able to consume sufficient feed. So a very simple calculation you can do to check this is the dry matter component of the diet as a percentage of the total prepared liquid feed. So it's your dry matter over your dry matter plus water, essentially. And when you get that percentage, if you're at or below 13%, your sows are going to be in trouble and condition will suffer. So if we take typical compound dry sow diet at 5.5 to 1, you're in the region of 13.8%. But when you creep on up to 5.8 to 1, you're talking 13%. And you really do need to be extra vigilant here, because at that stage, the water to meal ratio is excessive. And also just remember, any reductions to water to meal ratio reduces slurry volumes as well. So if it's possible, we'd recommend revisiting this. And I'll also just mention quickly the importance of fibre and fibre source in the diet. But Fiona O'Mara was on the podcast in May, and she did provide an excellent overview of developments in this area. But just this time of year, it's a reminder coming into harvest shortly, just keep an eye on that grain quality and maybe give your nutritionist a call regarding the type and inclusion rate of a mycotoxin binder for dry sows. And finally then, just if in terms of group management, if you can pen your thinner sows together if possible after transfer to the dry sow house, and just increase the feed allowance initially to this group. And when that condition returns to optimal, you can gradually bring this pen back onto the standard curve. So rather than maybe fiddling with the curve, you could put an extra 3 or 4 sows on that valve, if you like, in order to feed the allowance, and then just gradually drop those back until we're back to the curve. And that can help with just making sure we have the right condition coming into the farmhouse. And finally, then just to walk the dry sow house feed daily to monitor your pens. And this can also help in detecting repeats too.
Emer, we have to mention one of the main contributing factors to empty days, and that's repeats. Can you take us through some of the common issues you're seeing in this area, and then maybe give us some examples of perhaps good practices you've come across here?
Yes, absolutely, Amy. I suppose determining whether the repeat is regular or irregular from the outset, that's very, very important. And in the case of regular repeats, usually the cause is the result of service failure. This can be down to factors such as incorrect timing of AI or damaged semen. And your regular repeats then, that target again is in or around that 2/3 of your total repeats. So if the sour gilt isn't a second repeat and doesn't have a history of poor conception and generally is in good physical condition with no signs of injury or ill health, I would reserve that first repeat with those conditions attached, if you like. Whereas the irregular repeats then, this can be caused by factors such as maybe the sow being wrongly served when not on heat, but there also could be a problem with the sow, more importantly. And in general, there needs to be a good reason to reserve an irregular repeat, as your subsequent conception rate is lower among these animals. So if the female is a gilt or first litter and there's no obvious defects such as lameness or blind teats, she should be reserved. In other words, if the animal is near perfect, we'll give her a chance. Otherwise, the success rate of reserving an irregular repeat is quite low. And occasionally, look, irregular repeats can occur when a female perhaps did conceive but had an early abortion. But just be mindful that if you do decide to reserve, in this case, the first heat after resorption often doesn't work. So it is recommended to wait until the next cycle before reserving that animal. So in summary, reserve your first repeats, and aside from physically your best sows and on paper your best sows, cull any other irregular repeats, because chances are they're going to be a recurring problem on farm. And again, that will minimize the number of empty days incurred by such animals. But I will just say, if you're reviewing your procedures on farm as we go along and you're quite happy you're implementing most of these steps, but continue to experience problems such as low conception rates and excessive repeats, there just could be an underlying health condition there, and we'd certainly recommend you speak to your vet as soon as possible on it.
Finally, Emer, to touch on a point you made at the start about the importance of records, how can farmers better utilise this information that they have? And in your opinion, what are producers out there doing really well in this area?
Yes, certainly, Amy, the records, it's key really to, from the outset, we mentioned reviewing our records, but if the information isn't correct there, then we're really just being led in the wrong direction altogether. I can't emphasize enough how accurate sow records are essential for optimizing that breeding performance and securing the best reproductive results. The use of computer-based recording systems really can make this job very, very streamlined. And there's also excellent reports available on these systems at the touch of a button. So I suppose reviewing your reports regularly, but if you do have access to a computer-based system, the periodic checking of different reports available on the system. Firstly, I would say your farrowing rate report to review performance in this area. And this is an excellent report as it displays when removals or repeats are detected. So this can help you identify if there are trends here. So for example, if the report is showing a consistently high number of repeats from week 5 or 6 onwards, maybe this is telling us that the procedure for checking repeats at 3 weeks isn't effective. Or perhaps if scanning has been done, then it's not being done routinely, or there's a problem with the results. So this report is very, very useful, particularly because you can, I suppose, benchmark your performance against recent weeks and months as well. So you can kind of look inwardly at your own farm before you maybe benchmark against national or other figures that you might be discussing with other farmers. And next then, your herd parity profile report. This report provides you with a breakdown of the herd age spread among the different parities and the performance then within each. So just to check here your farrowing rate and born alive of each parity, but paying particular attention to gilt farrowing rate and your second litter born alives, as these metrics are key indicators of performance. We want to see ideally close to 90% farrowing rate for gilts and a gain of at least one pig born alive into that second litter. And this is a good indication that we are hitting targets here. But I know we've covered a lot today, Amy, that there's a good bit in it. But I suppose just to mention, Kieran Carroll and Louise Clark have an article in the newsletter, in this month's July's newsletter, where they do take a closer look at the financial impact of empty days and also the best practices regarding management of gestating sows. So I'd encourage listeners to check this out for further information.
Thanks, Emer. Nice to get a feel for what's really happening on the ground in terms of breeding and reproduction. And I'm sure there's plenty in there for people to think about, really.
Thanks, Amy.
That's it for this episode of The Pig Edge. And thanks a million to Emer for joining me on the show. Don't forget to listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from, so you never miss an episode. And for more information from the Pig Development Department, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Amy Quinn. Thanks for listening.